Welcome back to today's video. In today's video, I'm going to be making my prediction for the 2024 election 2 days before the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump based off of some recent polls. Before getting today's video, make sure to subscribe button down below and like the video. And so we're looking at the 2024 electoral map, specifically looking at several of the swing states. Let's go ahead and start with the state of Wisconsin. In the state of Wisconsin, we can currently see that Kamala Harris is beating Donald Trump by 1.5% based on an aggregate of polls. We can see the two recent polls show Donald Trump ahead by 1%, and an even more recent poll that was taken from September 3rd to September 6th shows Kamala Harris beating Donald Trump by 2%. Now, that being said, we do want to be aware that Wisconsin polling data does generally tend to underestimate Donald Trump by extremely large margins. A lot of the polls in the swing states do tend to underestimate Donald Trump. That being said, Wisconsin polling is, historically speaking, underestimating Donald Trump by larger margins than other polls. For example, let's go back to the 2020 election and the 2016 election, and let's take a look at how the polling data differed. So if you go back to the 2020 election, you can see that Biden was beating Donald Trump in the lead up to the election in about 8 polls or so by 6.7%. 6.7%. Yet in the actual election, he only ended up winning by 0.7%. And obviously, that is a 6-point margin of error where it overestimated Joe Biden. And again, we are in the lead up to this race at this point. We are currently on September 8th approximately right now. So if we go to around September 8th of 2020, we can see that Joe Biden at September 8th of 2020 was beating Donald Trump by 6.7%, and yet he only ended up winning by 0.7%. And even if you go back to 2016, you can see Hillary Clinton was leading in the polls by 6.5%, yet Donald Trump ended up winning by 0.7%. If you go back to around September or so of 2016, September 8th, you can see that Hillary Clinton was beating Donald Trump by 5.3%. So as you can see, the polling data, generally speaking, does tend to overestimate the Democrats, generally speaking, when it comes to the Biden, Trump, and Hillary Clinton. Trump by approximately 6% or 6 to 7%, really. When you look at the 2016, that's approximately 7.2%. So around 6 to 7%, it tends to overestimate the Democrats. So just taking a look at this poll here, you can see that based on an aggregate of polls, Kamala Harris is beating Donald Trump by only 1.5%. So this could very easily go to Donald Trump by maybe even 5% or 4%, the state of Wisconsin. So I see some real growth in terms of Donald Trump, of how much he can win this state, just due to the fact that how much the polling data has historically underestimated him in the state of Wisconsin. So I do believe that Donald Trump is going to win in the state of Wisconsin, and I just proved that to you in the previous polls. Moving on to the state of Michigan. Now, Michigan polling data, it is a little bit mixed as well, but let's take a look at this. Kamala Harris is currently ahead by 1.2%. And again, even if the polls are accurate, this still is going to be a very close election. Even if the polls are 100% accurate, it is still going to be a close race. So if we take a look at this, going back to 2020, based on the aggregate of polls leading up to the election, Biden was led by 4.2%. Now, Michigan polling data in the RCV aggregate was more accurate in 2020. And also, if you go back to approximately 2016 as well, you can see that Michigan polling data was also more accurate. If you go back to 2016, Clinton was ahead by 3.4%. Trump ended up winning by 0.3%. That's approximately a 3.7 margin of error, which, believe it or not, is not that big of a margin of error compared to Wisconsin. In 2020, you can see Biden, the polls overestimated him by 1.4%. In 2016, it overestimated Clinton by 3.7%. Okay, so that is something to consider there. It does tend to overestimate the Democrats. That being said, you can see that Michigan polling data, generally speaking, is more accurate than Wisconsin polling data in the lead up to the election. If you go back to September of 2020, you can see that the polling data was actually pretty good. It had Biden ahead by 3.2%, and he ended up winning by 2.8%, which is only a 0.6% margin of error in favor of Joe Biden. So Michigan polling data, it is a good possibility that possibly Donald Trump could win in this state. Kamala Harris is ahead by only 1.2%. We obviously do still want to keep on waiting for more polls to come in. The most recent poll actually was taken recently with Kamala Harris led by only 1%. So I don't think 1% is enough. I think she needs to be ahead by maybe 3% or so in order to have some good, solid, even a close election. She would have to be ahead by around 3% in the state of Michigan. Moving on to the state of Pennsylvania, currently it's a tie. Currently, Donald Trump and no, not Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris are tied currently. The most recent polls are showing that it's a very, very close election here, based on the most recent polls. If you go back to 2016, 2020, again, Pennsylvania polling data is more accurate. Pennsylvania polling data in the 2020 election was right on. It showed Biden had by 1.2%, and Biden ended up winning by 1.2%. And going back to 2016, we saw some similar results. We saw that Hillary Clinton was ahead by 1.9%. Trump ended up winning by 0.7%. So it was off by obviously around 2.6%, but not by that big of a margin. As you can see in 2020, it was pretty good. So the fact that it's tied currently does show that we have a very close race in the state of Pennsylvania. And that's one of the reasons why I don't like it when I don't think that it's good necessarily to just take a look at the polls and take them at their word entirely. For example, I think that Donald Trump is ahead in the state of Wisconsin by a larger margin than he's ahead in the state of Pennsylvania, even though the polls currently have Donald Trump doing worse in Wisconsin than Pennsylvania. And the reason is because you have to look at this in historical context. One of the good things that pollsters have in this election, 538, a lot of these pollsters have, is the fact that Donald Trump this is not the first time Donald Trump is running for the presidency, right? He ran for the presidency in 2016. He ended up winning. In 2020, he lost. But we really have two elections in the general election where Trump was running. And we really have two elections to look back at. And it's really important that we take a look at those two elections. And it is very helpful. So you do really need to look at this in historical context. Just because Donald Trump comes out one day leading in a state by 2% or Kamala Harris is leading by 3% doesn't necessarily mean that he's in a better position in that state compared to another state. You have to look at it within the historical context of the polls. Wisconsin polling data, generally speaking, tends to overestimate the Democrats by 5 to 6 point margins in the general election. Michigan and Pennsylvania polling data, it's pretty good. I mean, it's not that great, but it's pretty accurate. Generally speaking, it overestimates the Democrats by around 1% or 2%, but not that big of a deal. Georgia polling data, very interesting. It normally tends to overestimate Republicans in Georgia. So you have to look at this within the context. Nevada polling data tends to overestimate Republicans. Not always, but sometimes it does tend to overestimate Republicans. So you have to look at it within that historical context when you're looking at these polls. So moving on to the state of Nevada, currently Kamala Harris is ahead by 0.6%, which I think is great news for her campaign. And the reason why a 0.6% margin in the state of Nevada is important is because if you go back to 2020, you can see that Joe Biden in the lead up to the election was ahead by 2.4% based on the RCP aggregate, and he ended up winning by 2.4%. So that means the polls were exactly right on. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was behind Donald Trump by 1%. She ended up beating Donald Trump by 2.4%. So in 2020, you saw that the polls were accurate and they did not overestimate or underestimate Donald Trump. And then in 2016, you saw that the polling data dramatically underestimated Hillary Clinton by approximately 3.4%. Therefore, if you apply that average of polls over the course of the past two election seasons that Donald Trump was a part of, and you apply that to this margin, you see Kamala Harris's margin actually increases from what it is right now from 0.6%. So I really think Kamala Harris can bring in some inroads into Nevada, and really it's a good thing for her since she can kind of crack in to a Sunbelt state that many considered to be in the Donald Trump column for quite some time. I think Kamala Harris has a good chance of winning in Nevada, and if I was Kamala Harris, I would definitely spend some more time in the state of Nevada. Moving on from the state of Nevada, let's take a look at the state of Georgia. Georgia is a very interesting state. I think Kamala Harris has a high probability, a good chance, not a high probability, but a good chance of winning in the state of Georgia. If you go back to 2020, you can see that Donald Trump, in the lead up to the election, was beating Joe Biden by 1%, and Biden ended up leading by 0.3%, meaning that the polling data underestimated Donald Trump by 1.3% in the state of Georgia. If you go back to 2016, this is interesting. The Donald Trump was ahead by 4.8%. He ended up winning by 5.1%. But that was 2016. That was quite a lot. I mean, I did use 2016 for quite a few things. I don't want to change my positions just because it shows Donald Trump, doing a good job here. But you can see here that the polling data in 2016 was pretty accurate. It did again. This polling data actually underestimated Donald Trump by 0.3%. But you can see that if you go back to 2020 in Georgia, you can see the polling data did actually tend to underestimate Donald Trump by approximately 1.3%. So that is, sorry, overestimate Donald Trump by 1.3%. So I think that Kamala Harris, the fact that she's ahead by 0.1%, the fact that in the most recent polling data, it is pretty close. Kamala Harris is ahead, however, by 2%, 2%, and 1%. I think that will be extremely critical. Moving on from the state of Georgia, let's take a look at the state of Arizona. The state of Arizona, I'm going to go ahead and give this state here, taking a look at the polls. Donald Trump's currently ahead by 1.9%. If you go back to 2020, this is very interesting here. If you go back to 2020, Joe Biden was leading in the polls by 0.9%. He ended up leading by 0.3%, meaning that the polls overestimated Joe Biden by 0.6%. And then if you go back to 2016, actually, the polls are pretty accurate. It showed Donald Trump ahead by 4%. He ended up winning by 3.5%, meaning that the polls underestimated him by overestimated him by 0.5%. So in other words, it really is within a 0.5, 0.6% margin of error here in the last two election cycles. If you were to apply that 0.6, 0.5% margin of error to this particular poll, Donald Trump does still end up leading by a very slim margin in the state of Arizona. So I know a lot of people like to say, oh, the polls always underestimate Donald Trump. Not necessarily. You have to look at it by a state-by-state basis. I personally think that Donald Trump has a very high chance of winning in the state of Wisconsin. A very high chance. I would be very surprised if he does not win in the state of Wisconsin. And the reason is because if you look at historical trends, Donald Trump, generally speaking, is extremely underestimated by up to 6%. In 2016, it was even worse. The polls were off in 2016 by 7.2%. That's a crazy margin of error for the polls. They're underestimating Donald Trump. And Wisconsin polling data is extremely off. That being said, I'm skeptical of the state of Georgia. Currently, Kamala Harris is ahead by 0.1%. And the fact that the polls in 2020 underestimated Joe Biden. They underestimated Joe Biden by 1.3%. If you apply a 1.3% margin of error to Kamala Harris, that's a 1.4% margin of increase for Kamala Harris there in that particular state. So it is extremely important to look at this within the historical context. Moving on to the state of Virginia. Virginia polling data is actually interesting. Kamala Harris is only ahead by only 3 or 4% here. So that is kind of interesting. This poll was actually taken relatively recently. The Roanoke College poll was taken on August 20th. Which I know isn't that recent. It was about 18 days ago. That being said, I think since August 20th, Donald Trump, I believe, I don't know, he might have been a little bit better since August 20th in most of the polls at least. And I think that's extremely important. Kamala Harris is only leading by 3% there in the state of Virginia. Who knows what could happen there? It might be closer than we might think. And then also in the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is a swing state, surprisingly, in this election. We really took it off the swing state column for quite some time. I'm not sure if we necessarily took it off. We considered it partly a swing, not really. We kind of considered it as a state that Donald Trump, most people would consider it as a state that Donald Trump was going to win, but he ended up, kind of was leading by a big margin when it came to Joe Biden. But now the Kamala Harris is on the race. It is still close. Donald Trump in the most recent polls is ahead by a very slim margin of 1%, a very slim margin, and he's ahead by 0.7%. Kamala Harris was ahead by 2%, 1%, 2%. That was extremely devastating for Donald Trump. It was a Bloomberg Morning Consult poll. Nevertheless, he was still ahead, even in a New York Times Siena and a Survey USA poll. All right, so that is for the state of North Carolina. Let's take a go ahead right now and fill in some of the states here with the respective margins for either of the candidates. Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska at large, Nebraska's 1st congressional district, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Indiana, Iowa, West Virginia, South Carolina, Utah, Alaska, and the state of Hawaii. Let's go ahead and give Kamala Harris the state of Hawaii, along with Vermont, Connecticut, and the state of Delaware, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maryland, D.C., the congressional district of D.C. Let's go ahead and give her the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois, Donald Trump will end up winning the state of Missouri. Let's go ahead and give Donald Trump the state of Texas and the state of Florida. 2 big whopper electoral votes, 70 electoral votes in total, gained approximately 3 electoral votes after the 2020 census. Let's go ahead and give Kamala Harris the state of Colorado in the safe column, And let's also go ahead and give Kamala Harris the state of New York as well in the safe column. And we're going to go ahead and give Donald Trump the state of, let's go ahead and give Donald Trump the state of Ohio in the likely column, as well as giving Kamala Harris Maine at large, Maine's second congressional district, sorry, Donald Trump winning Maine second by a likely margin. Kamala Harris, Tim Walz winning the state of Maine's first congressional district by a safe margin. Maine at large by a lean margin. New Jersey also by a, I would say, likely to safe margin. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the safe column for now. And then we're going to go ahead and give the state of New Hampshire. We'll leave the state of New Hampshire for now and we'll come back to it. And also we'll leave the state of New Mexico for now and come back to it in a few seconds. Take a look at the state of New Hampshire. The state of New Hampshire, currently we can see that Donald Trump is behind. Actually, there's no polling data with Kamala Harris, but Joe Biden was beating Donald Trump by almost double digits there. So I'm going to give this state to Kamala Harris, really in the likely margin to safe margin, or likely to safe margin. In the state of New Jersey, I could potentially seeing it going in the likely column, as well as in the state of New Hampshire. Let's go ahead and give the state of New Hampshire. Recent polling data, Donald Kamala Harris had by 5% approximately. So let's go ahead and give that state in the likely column as well. And now let's go ahead and give the state of Minnesota. In the state of Minnesota, currently Kamala Harris is had by 5.5% likely column. Again, for Kamala Harris, Donald Trump will end up winning in the state of Wisconsin, Michigan, and also, I believe, in the state of Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris will end up winning in the state of Virginia by a lean margin. Let's go ahead and give Kamala Harris the state of Nevada. And let's also go ahead and give Donald Trump the state of Arizona and the state of Georgia. Not Arizona, Georgia. We're going to go ahead and give Kamala Harris the state of Georgia based on some of the recent polls and the historical trends that we have been seeing. And Donald Trump the state of North Carolina. The state of North Carolina and Nebraska's second congressional district. I will leave that as being blank for now. All right, so this is my prediction as of right now based on the most recent polls. Kamala Harris at 247 electoral votes. Donald Trump and the J.D. Vance ticket at 290 electoral votes. And just take a look at this. The state of Michigan, I just wanted to verify something really quick. I am doing this based off of recent polling data. So let's take a look at this. In the state of Michigan, she's currently ahead by 1.2%. If you take a look at this based off of historical trends, the polls overestimated Joe Biden by 1.4%. Apply that margin of error. Kamala Harris is behind by 0.2%. In 2016, it was even worse. The polls overestimated Hillary Clinton by 3.9%. Apply that, average the 3.9% with the 1.4%. You get approximately 2.4%. Add the 2.4% to the 1.2%. You get a 1.2% margin of victory for the former president. So that's what we have right now. The former president and Senator J.D. Vance at 290 electoral votes, and Kamala Harris and Congressman Tim Walz at 247 electoral votes. This is a very close election, guys. We could really see a flip in any of these states potentially. If Kamala Harris does potentially do good in the state of Michigan, which I do still see as being a possibility, she's at 262 electoral votes. And at that point, it would be a little bit of a difficult path for her since I don't really see her winning Wisconsin. But let's say she were to flip, let's say, for instance, Pennsylvania, she would win the election. Or if she were to flip the state of Arizona, she could do that. Potentially, she could try to win Michigan, win Arizona, Nevada, Georgia. Oh, that would be extremely difficult, though, to win Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan. I do see. I would feel that as being the case potentially. And I also think that in winning Nevada, I think that it is going to be important for her to win the state of Nevada. I think winning Nevada is going to be something that's much more doable in this election than some people may have thought. So I mean, her pathway to 270. I mean, she did say in a recent rally that she is the underdog. Oh, she did say in a recent rally that she's the underdog. And I mean, I would actually say that is actually true. She is the underdog in some respects. I mean, because what some people are looking at is they're seeing some of the general election polls. So some people are getting deceived by. Here's the thing, guys, and I hate it when people do this, okay? They look at some of the, let me zoom back here for a second. All right, let me take a look at this. They look at some of the general election polls. Let's take a look at this really quick, okay? They look at some of the general election polls, okay? And they see in some of these polls, Kamala Harris is ahead by 6%, 2%, 3%, 3%, 2, 3, 1%. This is crazy. Kamala Harris is going to win the election by a huge margin. And they say, oh, the election's over, okay? But here's the problem. These are general election polls. And when you keep on seeing general election polls, it honestly like blurs your vision, because you have to understand Kamala Harris's path to 270 is a very narrow path. She would have to win. Just again, let's say some of you guys think, if there are some people who think that Kamala Harris cannot win any state in the Sun Belt. She can't win Georgia. She can't win Arizona. She can't win Nevada. I personally think that's false. I think she could win Georgia. Based on the recent polling data, you can see here Kamala Harris in the state of Georgia is ahead by 0.1%. She's ahead by 0.1%. And if you take a look at the previous election, Joe Biden was was behind by 1% in the polls. He ended up winning. So the fact that Kamala Harris is ahead, either the polls are totally off, or it's just that Kamala Harris is making some inroads. And so I think that Georgia is a possibility, but I really think that she should focus a little bit more on the Sun Belt. I think Arizona personally is a bit out of reach. It is a border state. You have to understand that as well. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, like in order to win, for those who say that Kamala Harris cannot win any state in the Sun Belt, what she would have to do at that point is win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Okay, and then she'd have to win Nebraska's second congressional district. And personally, if I were her, I wouldn't bet my entire election off of one congressional district in a rural district in the state of Nebraska, which has voted for Republicans in almost every single election prior to 2020. I wouldn't necessarily bet my entire election off of one congressional district, lest it go to the House of Representatives and we would have a nightmare scenario, which would be quite disturbing for the majority of Americans. But this is really a close election, and she really has to spend some more time in these states. That's all I could really say. Like, she has to spend a lot of time, a lot of campaigning, a lot of efforts. She has to get these states in her columns. She has a very slim path. Is it a better path than Joe Biden had? Absolutely, absolutely. This is a much better path than what we saw with Joe Biden. If Joe Biden was the nominee, I'd be giving Donald Trump the state of Minnesota, Virginia, Georgia, Arizona. Like, I mean, this election would be a bloodbath for the Democrats in House seats and Senate seats. It would really affect them in a negative direction. But it is going to be a very close race. But if you like this video, make sure to subscribe button down below and like the video. We do want to reach 500 subscribers relatively soon, and every subscriber definitely helps out. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the video, share, and comment down below who you think also is going to win the debate. I will probably put up a community post for who you guys think is going to win the debate. And I think that I think it's going to be a close debate. I'm not really sure who's going to win, but we'll see. And make sure to subscribe button down below and like the video, and I'll see you in the next video.